Start by introducing our team. Today we have Jen Eckerly, the Executive Director of the Ocean Protection Council, Mike Escrow, our Senior Biodiversity Program Manager and Tribal Liaison. My name is Abby Mohan, and I am one of the 30 by 30 Program Managers, and I'm joined by Dr. Ann Deep, the other 30 by 30 Program Manager. And we're also really thrilled today to have Mina Adabag, our 30 by 30 OPC Summer Intern. However, we also are very pleased to collaborate with the Ocean Science Trust, and on their team is Dr. Liz Whiteman, the Executive Director, and Dr. Heidi White, a Science Officer at Ocean Science Trust. So we're here today to talk about 30 by 30, and in October 2020, Governor Newsom issued Executive Order N8220, which committed California to conserving 30% of its lands and coastal waters by 2030, the 30 by 30 target, putting California at the leading edge of an international movement to protect nature. California's 30 by 30 initiative has three main priorities: to protect biodiversity, expand access to nature, and mitigate and build resilience to climate change. So in 2022, the California Natural Resource Agency released Pathways to 30 by 30, which details strategies and opportunities on how we're going to achieve this goal. Pathways defines 30 by 30 conservation areas as an area that is durably protected and achieves biodiversity outcomes. Right now, our state MPA network of 124 marine protected areas covering 16.2% of coastal waters aligns with the definition of conservation set forth in Pathways. So the Ocean Protection Council has identified four primary approaches in order to achieve this goal. Today's presentation centers on the proposed science-based framework to evaluate and advance protection and conservation of California's coastal waters and meet this goal. This includes continuing to adaptively manage our state MPA network, strengthen protections in our national marine sanctuaries, support indigenous marine stewardship areas, and evaluate all the other marine managed areas that are already in our coastal waters. So to provide scientific guidance on 30 by 30 implementation, we have been really fortunate to assemble, through partnership with the Ocean Science Trust, a technical advisory panel composed of experts working in California and around the world. This is hard stuff, and the task of how to evaluate biodiversity, access, and climate mitigation and resilience in coastal waters is not an easy one. This panel has met many times during the winter and spring on the development of this decision-making process, and they are going to continue to guide us as we navigate the next steps. Okay, so now the reason we are all here is in order to talk about the decision-making framework. So it starts with the question of how do we evaluate area-based management? Understanding and assessing the ways that marine managed areas can benefit biodiversity, provide human access, and climate resilience benefits can be really complex. This is definitely a sticky problem we've been working on. The international scientific community has been grappling with this same challenge for many years and has developed robust tools for evaluating the effectiveness of area-based management. To develop this framework, we are relying on multiple resources and international guidance, including the MPA Guide, the International Union for Conservation of Nature site-level tool for evaluating other effective area-based conservation measures, OECMs, as well as guidance specific to California, including reports to the OPC Science Advisory Panel and lessons learned from the first decadal management review of California's MPA network. All right, so let's get into this process. This framework is a four-step process, and I will walk you through each step and how to get from a candidate to a designated 30 by 30 conservation area in coastal waters. As I'm talking, Mina is going to be dropping in some links in the chat, so it's going to help sort of connect a lot of the documents and information that I'm sharing. So the first step in the framework is looking at durability. This is fundamental to 30 by 30. But this one is actually easy because the definition in Pathways of durable protection means anything that has gone through a formal process and is not easily undone. Once you've checked for durability, your next step is to evaluate biodiversity. So for this, we're going to look at breaking up the process into two pathways. One, for areas created primarily for biodiversity conservation. For example, the California MPA network or National Marine Sanctuaries. And the other pathway is for areas created for reasons other than biodiversity conservation. For the areas created primarily for biodiversity conservation, we propose using the MPA Guide, a science-based, policy-relevant framework based on peer-reviewed scientific literature. The MPA Guide was originally published in the journal Science in 2021. Use of this framework can identify immediate opportunities to strengthen existing MPAs, and MPAs, in conjunction with climate mitigation strategies and more sustainable uses of the ocean, can conserve and restore biodiversity and the resilient ecosystems needed for human well-being. So the MPA Guide looks at the whole picture of a marine area. It starts with the enabling conditions. What led to this area being designated for protection? What biodiversity was there that created the area? Then it looks at the stage of establishment of the marine protected area. How long has it been managed? How long has it been in place? Has it been there long enough to show some biodiversity outcomes? Then it looks at the level of protection the area provides. How are you protecting this area? And these all get together and get us to the likely outcome for this marine protected area. So areas being evaluated using the MPA Guide will be classified based on the level of protection. This can have 5 outcomes. The first 2 outcomes when evaluating level of protection are incompatible and minimally protected. If it's incompatible, it is not a candidate for 30 by 30. It means there's some activity permitted that is incompatible with the conservation of biodiversity. If it's minimally protected, efforts should be made to work with area managers to improve those protections. The next outcome is lightly protected. These areas will remain candidates for 30 by 30 and may still qualify if they provide access and climate resilience benefits. The 4th and 5th outcomes are fully protected and highly protected. These areas qualify for 30 by 30. Fully or highly protected areas, like our California's MPA network, have the greatest potential to protect biodiversity, confer resilience, and benefit species and ecosystems. For these fully, highly, and lightly protected areas, it's essential to evaluate access benefits, climate mitigation resilience benefits, and to identify opportunities for further qualification. So now let's look at those areas that were not created primarily for biodiversity conservation and how are we going to evaluate those. Some examples of this could be fisheries management area, water quality protection areas. So for these areas, we will use the IUCN site level tool for identifying other effective area-based conservation measures. This guide was created because there is a need to evaluate the effectiveness of these sites and to give recognition of the biodiversity benefits that they provide. So this tool looks at sites a little differently than the MPA Guide. Rather than evaluating all the activities and protections that exist within a site, this tool uses a series of criteria to determine if a site qualifies and provides that level of biodiversity protection. So the first thing you want to look at is biodiversity values. What is here that makes this place special? If there isn't biodiversity that you want protected, you don't need to evaluate the site. This is rarely a problem in California's coastal waters as we have so many special places with many types of biodiversity values. The second thing you evaluate is what are the threats and pressures that exist at this location. If impaired water quality would be detrimental to biodiversity in an area, for example, an estuary or a wetland, then water quality protections would be really critical to address those threats. The third criteria you evaluate are the management actions. What regulations, policy, management, and activities are in place? And do those activities meet the threats and pressures sufficiently to provide biodiversity protection? And then the fourth criteria is the likely outcome. Can you say yes? Is there a reasonable likelihood that the important biodiversity values for which this site is identified will be conserved in the long term? So for this site, when you go through this evaluation, rather than 5 outcomes, it's pretty straightforward. You get a very clear yes or no answer. So if the site doesn't qualify as an OECM, it has no reflection on the effectiveness of that site in doing what it was created to do. But it isn't providing sufficient biodiversity benefits to qualify without additional action. For example, removing a specific threat or barrier. And if a site is yes, it qualifies as an OECM, it will be a candidate for 30 by 30 and go on to the next steps in this evaluation process, access and climate. So as final steps, evaluating access and climate mitigation and resilience benefits are essential to advance California's 30 by 30 goals. Ultimately, if an area meets the necessary criteria through either the MPA guide or the IUCN OECM site tool, it can be designated as a 30 by 30 conservation area. This framework emphasizes working with area managers to improve protections and thoroughly evaluating biodiversity, access, climate mitigation, and resilience benefits. So I've just packed a lot of information in a pretty short period of time. More detail on this process and resources to perform an evaluation can be found in our 30 by 30 draft decision-making framework for coastal waters. And I believe Mina has dropped the link into the chat. So this webinar comes on the heels of the kickoff of our 120-day public comment period that started at our June 4th council meeting. We have already started a pretty robust conversation. We have been meeting with agency partners, NGOs, fishermen, and we really look forward to continuing the dialogue throughout the summer. We have tried to create many opportunities for the public to engage on this process. So if you want to step out of the virtual world and come meet us in person, OPC is going to host a series of in-person regional workshops this summer, starting on July 10th in San Diego. And then in August, we'll be heading up the Central Coast into Monterey. And in September, we'll be going up to Arcata. And then after our workshops, at the end of this public comment period, we will host another webinar with some final reflections on everything that we've heard during this period. And during this time, OPC will accept feedback and comments from this framework at the email address on the screen. And following the public comment period, the evaluation criteria will be finalized in consultation with our technical advisory panel in fall 2024. And so with that, I want to say thank you for your time, and I think we're going to open it up to some questions.
Thank you so much, Abby. Before we do that, just want to reiterate one more time that all our information about these workshops, how to register, and etc., is in that link that Mina just dropped in the chat. So really looking forward to connecting with everybody. And just for a little bit of questions logistics, there's 2 ways we can go about this, folks. Feel free to come off camera and use the React. So if you click the React, there should be a raise hand. This automatically queues people up, and that helps me moderate. We also can have questions dropped in the chat as well, and I'll be kind of bouncing back and forth between both to do a robust Q&A. And with that, let's start. Ricky, I see that you're off mute.
Yes, I am. I'm trying to figure out how to get my camera to go. There, I did. Thank you very much for that, Abby. Really appreciate you guys presenting this. I had a question with respect to the spatial area. So I've heard that the Marine Region 7 is what's being considered as the marine waters layer. And I just wondered if you could explain more about where does the marine, and coastal waters decision making sort of get split, and are all estuaries being considered in the coastal portion and marine portion of this, or are some being handled differently? And then how do we handle things like connectivity, across the land? I realize it has to be two processes and understand that. But maybe if you could just speak to that more a bit.
Yeah, no problem. So, the outer boundary is our state waters because this is a 30 by 30 initiative for California state waters. And as far as the inner boundary of the layer, the major bays and estuaries are going to be included in coastal waters. And there are several like smaller estuaries. Some are currently already part of our MPA network, and we are looking at the marine region boundary layer. You're correct, in order to delineate between the land side and the coastal water side. And we hope to have a final shapefile that will make it really clear for anyone to determine,
Okay.
is this on my coastal waters or is this on the land side process by the end of summer. However, I would just note that 30 by 30 is a statewide initiative. And so whether something falls on the land side or falls on the coastal water side, if there is some good conservation and protections for biodiversity, there's a process for it to be evaluated no matter where on the boundary it happens to fall. And we are also working really closely. Your second question about connectivity, it's a really important one, and that's a big part, and that's a theme that's echoed in Pathways repeatedly. And we are working closely with our landside partners and ensuring that there is that connectivity, and that those areas, those complementary conservation measures, if there is a protected 30 by 30 area on the land side, well, that's providing a lot of benefits to those coastal waters on the coastal water side. So that sort of complementary conservation is being taken into consideration, especially when we're doing the evaluation of all the OECMs and looking at threats and pressures in that area.
Thanks.
No problem.
Awesome. We have Sherry next.
Hi, I'm Sherry Hafer. I'm a wife of a commercial fisherman for 37 years, and I'm a director of Central Coast Women for Fisheries and the REACT Alliance. So my kind of comment and question is, I don't know if you're familiar with Ray Hilborn, but he's a famous fishery scientist. And he just put out this report. They've done a lot of work on MPAs and their benefits, and they just did a recent review of MPAs, and this is some of the things he said. He said a recently proposed method to evaluate biodiversity protection requiring no-take areas as the only way to sufficiently protect the ocean in U.S. marine waters is severely flawed and will damage U.S. interests if adopted. He says, recent reviews of the extensive MPA network in California have concluded there's no evidence for a regional increase in biodiversity or target fish abundance, nor is there evidence for the MPAs providing climate resilience. So with that in mind, what he found was, you keep squeezing fishermen into small areas, those areas get overfished. And so then the balance is a net zero. So you have to consider that. Also consider that there's many other threats, and that's what he lists also. There's other threats to the ocean that won't be protected by no-take areas, including global warming, ocean acidification, sea level rise, exotic species, shipping, coastal development, and a terrestrial runoff and sediments of pollutants. So, you're only taking the fishermen off, which there's very few left. There used to be like 15,000 fishermen in 2020, and we're down to like less than 5,000. So I don't think the fishermen are the threat. And I don't know, according to the scientists, that MPAs are really helping. So that's my comment is, are you considering other scientists and other, people saying that no-take areas isn't really truly the answer? That's my question.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. I can take this one. Mike Escrow, I'm a senior scientist at OPC, and I'm working really closely with my colleagues Ann and Abby to lead our 30 by 30 work. And I haven't seen the specific report, Sherry, that you're referencing, so it'd be great to take a look at that. I am pretty familiar with Dr. Hilborn's work, and I think, I would honestly respectfully disagree with the conclusion that, recent monitoring hasn't shown any MPA benefit. I think the overall take-home message of the decadal management review is that we're seeing increases in biomass of some highly targeted species in some habitats in some places, right? So I think it's good news on some fronts. It's also a complicated story, and we know that MPAs aren't a panacea, right? They're not going to be the only tool in our toolbox to achieve ocean conservation because, like you said, they don't do a lot to mitigate for some of the other threats that you mentioned, water quality first and foremost among them, right? So I want to make really clear to everybody on this webinar that 30 by 30 is not solely an MPA exercise, right? Adaptive management of the network that we have is part of how we get to 30 by 30, but we're really committed to taking a threat-based approach where we look at the whole totality of threats to coastal water, to biodiversity in coastal waters, and
We're
think
reading,
about
we're reading that you're wanting 13% more in MPAs. That's what,
13%, no, 13% more conserved according to our definition of a 30 by 30 conserved area. And what this framework allows us to do is to consider both MPAs as well as other spatial management measures like water quality protections, like fisheries management areas that might have that additional biodiversity benefit. So MPAs can help us get there, but they're not the only tool in the toolbox that we're considering.
yeah.
Does that make more sense?
Yeah, and I just, I want everyone to know that it was a very, very long process to get what we got. And it was my husband going to 3 years of meetings with scientists, other stakeholders, with state agencies and NGOs, and they came to this conclusion. And I just feel like, that this isn't something that's going to happen in a blink of an eye, and that there's a lot of thought already put into it, and that's all. I don't see why you guys want to add any more. If anything, some of them should be taken away, especially the ones close to port. Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry. Appreciate your
Thank you,
comment.
Sherry. For sure. We have a couple questions in the chat and then we'll jump back to the webinar. So we have a question from Pam Hetherington. Durably protected, would you speak to what this means?
I would be happy to answer that. And it's very clearly laid out in pathways. We want our areas to be durably protected. It's interesting because water is already, nobody can own the water, right? It's already a state resource. And so any area that is managed for some sort of protection or in some sort of way has a managing agency that has gone through a formal process in order to either make it a water quality area, a fisheries management area, a marine protected area. Like Sherry was just saying, there's a lot of thought and a lot of work that goes into these processes to make these sort of areas. And so they then can't be simply undone. So the durably protected is just making sure that it is an area that is that can't be simply undone. And in our coastal waters, that also means that it's an area that'll be managed by some sort of agency, because it won't be managed by a private land trust, for example, like it could potentially be on the land site.
Thanks, Abby. And the next question we have in the chat before jumping back is from Donna Myers. Once submitted, how long do you envision an OECM would take to be approved for California 30 by 30?
That's a great question. So the first part of this process is there's already a lot of areas, there's already a lot of lines drawn on the map of California's coastal state waters. And we want to do a thoughtful process in evaluating all those areas that already exist. Once this framework is finalized, we'll start that evaluation process. We hope to have some preliminary results this winter, and we hope to sort of go through and evaluate all of the areas that already exist between the winter and next spring. For new areas, it could be considered a candidate, and what those areas look like is sort of to be determined. And once again, this goes back to the process of the managing agency. So for example, the water boards have a very clear process on how to create a new water quality protection area, and an OECM would have to go through that process. So it becomes, gets to that durably protected bar. So how long it would take to be approved is going to depend on the mechanism of approval and which agency and which process we're sort of working with. I do know that the state is very supportive of 30 by 30 and is very encouraging that all agencies work on towards meeting this goal. And so I know that it will be worked on as efficiently as possible.
Thanks, Abby. We're going to jump back to our live Q&A for the hand raise. Dave Coker, I have you up next. Please feel free to unmute and come on camera.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Hi. Okay, unfortunately, I can't do the video, but it doesn't really matter. Dave Coker, I'm the executive director of the Ventura County Commercial Fishermen's Association. I'm here because, this is going to affect areas that we fish. We heavily fish our islands, the Channel Islands, and the areas surrounding that. So I have 3 questions. I'll try to keep them brief, but what I'm seeing so far is stoking 3 questions. The first one is going to be in regard to the in-person meetings that you have coming up. Is there any other information besides what's going to be entailed in this meeting here? Any other benefits or information for attending those workshops other than just face-to-face? And if so, well, I guess that's the first question.
Yeah, happy to take that. And Abby, feel free to jump in. The in-person face-to-face would be a really great time to connect and also share the specific regional concerns. So your regional insights and your local insights as to how this framework could impact you, your community, and your work is the first one. And second, really encourage the regional workshops just because OPC is really committed to making sure that we are connecting with all our partners. And this is something long-standing that we've heard from everybody across community and stakeholder groups, which is that we want to see you out here in our community, out here on the waters with us. And so this is, our opportunity to connect with you, because I know that Zoom is very impersonal, and we would love to stand where you live and stand where you work and see how these things impact you. So I would say those are the 2 things. And Abby, maybe you could speak to some of the activities we hope to have at the workshop as well.
Yeah, so the workshop will be like a very similar forum where we have this opportunity to discuss the framework and the process as a whole and hear feedback on it. And then the second part of the workshop, we're going to have some dedicated time to really talking about the sort of threats and pressures that are those local regional issues. You're a fisherman. I forget where you said you fish. Oh, that's right, Channel Islands. You were fishing around the Channel Islands. Well, that's going to be a very different conversation fishing in Southern California than fishing in Northern California or Central California. And so we want to make sure that we have opportunity to hear about the differences across the state.
Okay. All right. Very nice. And is there any virtual option for that, or are they strictly in person?
Those are going to be in person. We weren't able to come up with the capacity for doing virtual options.
And
so that's why I'm offering the virtual webinar and the in-person. So that way people can access us either way.
I understand. Okay, great. Thank you very much for the answers. The second question or comment, I do agree with Sherry prior her comment there that the more pressure, the more closures that are created, the more pressure is put onto open areas. And I just want to make sure that comment is taken into consideration, because we do put more pressure on open areas, which skews results of what the impacts of fishing are in areas. If you take a certain percentage away, I think that just kind of makes sense. As you take areas away, the open areas have more pressure on them. And we can't just say get rid of fishermen altogether, because then we have a dependency on foreign fish being brought in, and we have no control over their fishing practices, and the ocean doesn't have doors. So everything kind of connects with itself. And, our management here needs to take that into consideration, that we just don't want to take away a lot of area so that we can then the little area that's being left has a huge impact. That's just a comment, and I agree with Sherry on that perspective. And I'd also like to see the Ray Hilborn report too. I haven't seen that yet, but I will look into that. And then, so I don't take up too much time, I'm going to move into my third question here, which is in regard to a resolution that's being introduced by Steve Bennett called ACR 210. I don't know if this is the proper forum to bring it up, but because it includes the Ocean Protection Council in its language, it seems to be pushing. To me, I'm just evaluating what he's trying to do, which is something that'll be read on the Committee of Water, Parks, and Wildlife on the 25th here next week. And it introduces the idea that it seems to push Ocean Protection Council, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, to expedite this process to creating these 30-30 areas a lot faster than what you guys are doing, which to me would seem to circumnavigate the process that you're doing right now. And I was wondering if you had any insight on that. It might be a little premature because he hasn't actually read it on the Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee State Assembly floor yet. But coming out of that, it seems to be something that would impact the OPC. And I was wondering if you had any comments on that, whether you are for resolutions like that seemingly expedite this process, or if I'm too early on the question.
Yeah, I can take that one, Dave. So OPC can't obviously take a position on legislation unless the governor's office does, but what I will, legislation or pending legislation or resolutions, but a formal position. But what I will say is that we're aware of the resolution. It is non-binding. That's important. And OPC is staying the course with our 4 approaches. So we're really proud of the thought we've put into the 4 approaches. We're proud of the transparent public process that we've built, and with our partnership with the Fish and Game Commission and CDFW on their transparent and public process for MPA adaptive management. So we are staying the course, and I think I will leave it at that. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, it is. And I really didn't expect much more of an answer than that. This is all something that's kind of coming down fast. So at any rate, that concludes my 3 questions. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. And I will send emails and get in contact with you guys for sharing our perspective in the event that I'm not able to attend the in-person meetings.
For sure. Thank you so much, Dave. Hopping back to the chat for the queue. Thank you so much for folks who came on camera. I'm just kind of going the chronological order when we receive these questions, so thank you for your patience. We have a question from Beverly, and I apologize if I butcher your last name, Scharnhorst. Hello, can you speak more about what the evaluation guidance for access and guiding questions for climate resilience will be for this framework? Also, because access and climate require one benefit to qualify, what will the threshold be for each benefit? Thank you for your time and for all your work on this framework. Very exciting.
I'll take that one. Thanks, Beverly. So I'll say that evaluating access and climate is a very sort of tricky component in coastal waters. However, the state has been doing a lot of deep thinking on this, and there was conservation priorities identified in our pathways document for both access and climate mitigation and resilience benefits. And those priorities were the foundation for our evaluating climate and access framework, which is being worked through that sort of guidance. The technical details of that guidance is currently sitting with our technical advisory panel, and we're iterating with them to come up with the final form of that. There is like the draft version of it that's in the draft decision-making framework that was released that Nina had linked to. So as far as what the final guiding questions are, they'll be coming as we sort of iterate them through the process with the advisory panel. And one of the reasons that it's one benefit to qualify is because benefits are very different. For example, an access benefit question that is looking at preserving tribal heritage or cultural practices answers a very clear access need in the state that is like really different than like, are there facilities that are being maintained or harbors or ports that allow some access to an area? So the reason that it's one threshold to meet the threshold is because the questions sort of answer different needs. And with climate mitigation and resilience, that's also very different too, because when you think about climate resilience, some things you kind of can't do anything about with area-based management, but monitoring might really help you. And some areas might be like really important for carbon sequestration. So like acknowledging that climate benefit is really important in that area. So it's kind of you have to have one because you in order to be able to answer this sort of specific guidance. I think I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Thanks, Abby. And one more question in the chat before we hop back to our video Q&A. This one comes from Jamie Blatter. are you hoping that most of the 30% will come from evaluating qualifying existing protected areas / OECMs rather than creating new protected areas / OECMs? What would be the process for creating new designations if that is deemed necessary?
Well, I think the key word in that question is hoping, how things are going to go out. So we have not done the evaluation of all the OECMs. So I don't think we like hope. I think it is what it is. Like things are going to, like the reason we're creating a science-based framework is things will qualify or they won't qualify. And this evaluation process is going to allow us to determine where the state is now with all of the areas that we already have on the map. Once we know where we're at, then we'll be able to do a better job evaluating on what we need to do to get to that goal of 30%. So I don't think we're hoping. I think we just are going to use this process to figure out and do a proper assessment of where we're at of the existing areas. And then as far as creating new, we're really hoping that the process of evaluating all these OECMs will, one, identify opportunities to strengthen the things that already exist in order that they might qualify. I think that's sort of the easiest process, the easiest low-hanging fruit in order to get something to qualify is to take what already exists and make it better and get it to rise and meet that bar. But we presume that there's going to be some area that's not going to all get us to 30%. And so then we'll have to start that process for creating new designations or new OECMs. And what that process looks like, once again, is going to depend on which sector it's the sort of that OECM is being created for or to protect. There's also the Indigenous Marine Stewardship Areas, which is one of our strategies within the 4 approaches. And we're in like the really early process of what IMSAs would look like and how they're going to sort of qualify towards 30 by 30. And then there's an ongoing process with the Greater Farallones Marine Sanctuary and updating their management plan that won't be sort of finalized until 2026. So we're not really hoping. I think if we were at 30% right now, we'd like to see some strengthened protections in order for as a part of the 30 by 30 process. We're all doing a lot of work, so we'd like to see some strengthened conservation, but we're just trying to get the best, make sure we make the best fit for everything.
Thank you, Abby. We'll go ahead and hop back now to the folks who are on the video queue. We have Vicky Hoover first. Vicky, please feel free to unmute.
Sorry, I'll pass at the moment. I don't have a new question.
Sounds good. In that case, we'll pass it to Sandy.
One, thank you all so much for the huge amount of work that's gone into this. I was curious to know, are you all engaged in, there's, I guess, a process within sort of the conservation community that's working on OECM guidance. And my understanding is that they are in the, yes, you're all nodding, great. So there's, I guess, a guide being created for evaluative criteria, and you're all plugged into that. It looks like yes. Great. That was my question.
We're really fortunate. Kirsten Garud-Colvert, who is one of the lead authors of the MPA guide, she's also on the working group that's working on that process, and she sits on our technical advisory panel. So that process is still in development, and I think they've only had a few meetings, but so it's relatively early on in that process, but we're definitely being made aware of how that additional guidance can help support our process.
And I'll
Excellent.
just jump
Great.
in to add, for any of these international tools, right, be it the MPA guide, the OECM tool, the work that Kirsten is doing, that Dr. Garud-Colvert is doing on kind of fleshing out that IUCN tool, which we're just sort of starting to hear about and very curious to hear how that unfolds. The key is really going to be to think through with experts and communities and stakeholders how that guidance touches down in California, where fisheries management, environmental management is very different than the global ocean as a whole, right? So I think that that's something we really want to emphasize as we work through this is, okay, some of these sort of more general terms and guidelines in these broad tools, what do they mean specifically for California?
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you. We're going to jump back to questions in the chat now. We have a follow-up from Donna Myers. Thank you. A follow-up question to my first cue. Can a designated reserve via an NGO, for example, we have a program of World Surfing Reserves, which focus on stewardship activities and advocacy for wave resources and larger physical and water quality conditions, as well as nearshore habitats that we may possibly use the OECM process to evaluate. Would these NGO/local government designated reserves be eligible for consideration if we complete the analysis as outlined?
So everything would go back to that definition of durability. And so if a local government had created an area that, through its public charter, through its mandate, was being managed in such a way, for example, in their coastal adaptation planning management plan or something like that, they created an area, that then had some sort of conservation benefit, then it would be eligible. It's challenging because of the nature that state waters are not owned by anybody. So an sort of NGO only designated area doesn't quite meet that definition of durability in state waters, unfortunately.
Thank you.
But
Oh.
sorry, just one quick thing to add. I think the thing that's important there too is that there are opportunities for partnership, right? So if there is local community NGO interest in designating something, what kind of partnerships can OPC as a connector facilitate between that NGO, that local community, that local tribe, and either state, federal, or local agencies who can provide a little bit more durability to that protection? Because I think one of the things that's really cool about the land side of 30 by 30 is it's very grassroots and community driven. It's local land trusts who are interested in purchasing land to preserve it, conserve it from development, right? And I think since obviously the ocean, like Abby said, is a public trust resource, it works very differently in coastal waters. But to the extent we can, we're trying to mirror that spirit of community-led conservation and hoping to kick off that conversation about what's important, what's under threat, what access do you want to see protected at these regional workshops.
Awesome. The next question we have in the chat is for Ricky Erickson, but you also have your hand raised, Ricky. I wasn't sure
Yeah.
if you was going to ask the same
Yeah,
question.
they're two different questions. I can ask the questions, both of them, the two-part questions. So my question one is on like you kind of have these three major bins of biodiversity, conservation, access, and climate change. My question is, are those equitably rated, or if a site has all three, is it rated higher? Versus it only provides access but doesn't provide biodiversity benefits. Like, is there a system in place, or are you envisioning this system kind of identifying some way of ranking and prioritizing sites? That's
So
my first. Yeah.
So I can answer that. I would say the first thing is that it really is primarily 30 by 30 is primarily about biodiversity. And so that biodiversity conservation threshold is the first threshold. And so that's why we have our two pathways to evaluate biodiversity first.
Awesome.
If you are lightly protected or you are an OECM, then we'll evaluate access and climate as the next steps, but you have to meet that biodiversity bar first.
Perfect. My second question goes to, so 30% of coastal and marine habitats in California. My question is California interpreting that to ensure that we are protecting 30% of every major habitat type in the coastal and marine ecosystem? So are we going to have 30% of estuaries and 30% of deep sandy and rocky sea bottom? Or could we potentially end up with an OECM sort of network or protected area network that only encompasses, let's say, 5% of rocky reef habitat in the state?
So the state for the MPA process really looked at a lot of habitats and so tried to get some representative habitats within the MPA network. And then the 30 by 30 goal is looking at 30% overall, and it's not breaking down the conservation by percent of habitat of the area.
Right. So even if the MPA network didn't contain representation across the state, there's not an effort to fill that gap with 30 by 30. It's just 30% of the ocean.
It's just 30% of the state waters, but I would say
Okay.
that if there's a gap or an underrepresentation, that's one of the biodiversity values that is identified in the
So we
IUCN.
should prioritize that.
Exactly. So so as far as an OECM, that would be a reason, that would be a biodiversity value reason in order to sort of evaluate an area. So even if 30% of each type of habitat isn't our goal, that doesn't mean that that isn't a consideration that we would take seriously and diligently.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Abby. We're going to hop right back just in the queue. There is a question in the chat before we go to our folks on the video. This one comes from Sherry. Will there be any protections from high voltage cable installation and emission of electromagnetic fields, once through cooling from offshore wind substations and noise pollution from high resolution geographic surveys of thousands of miles of offshore wind leases and cable routes?
Mike, you gonna take this?
Yeah, I could take this one. Yeah, I mean, Sherry, you're making some good points. I think, it's important to remember that 30 by 30 is only one of a bunch of different things that OPC is doing to protect biodiversity, to promote climate resilience, to support our sustainable blue economy, to enhance equity, right? All those goals that are in our strategic plan. So offshore wind is something that we're definitely looking at and engaging with really closely. We've recently, and we're actually working with Ricky at California Marine Sanctuary Foundation on this, spinning up expert working groups of scientists as well as tribal experts to really dig in on some specific topical areas, some of which you're raising here, and develop comprehensive environmental monitoring guidance for offshore wind. So I think that's the first step, right? Is to develop that guidance, understand what the different impacts of offshore wind might be and how they should be monitored. And then I think going down the road, I mean, if there are ways that offshore wind, there can be a nexus between offshore wind and 30 by 30 through the OECM pathway, thinking about area-based management, we're certainly open to it. But I think because floating offshore wind in California is so new, and we do have these really ambitious goals and targets, we need to really, kind of take it slow and think through the science and think through the impacts before I would sort of feel comfortable commenting more on like what that nexus might be.
Can I
Early days. I hope that's
comment?
helpful.
Yeah, can I just make a comment that so they're out there doing surveys right now and they're using up to, we just heard 240 decibels out there and fairly low frequencies too. We didn't realize we thought they're only permitted to go to 228, but then Equinor just handed us this handout that showed they're using sub-bottom profilers that are 240. So anyways, we have been asking for biological and acoustic monitoring for HRG surveys, high resolution geographic surveys. And we have been ignored and told that it wasn't necessary, there's not going to be any impacts. Well, nobody really knows that for sure because there's never been a study proving either way whether these high resolution geographic surveys are causing impacts to our fisheries and to the ocean. And there are some studies that show especially small species like anchovies and sardines are very sensitive to this high acoustic noise, and they have injuries or at least changes in behavior that can affect the bottom of the food chain, and that affects everything all the way up. I mean, you hear about these starving sea lion cubs, starving pelicans. Maybe it's because they're doing all this mapping 24/7 since April 19th off our coast. I don't know, but anyways, so I just wanted to tell you our ideas. We think they should be using studies that have a lot of baseline data already. There's NOAA's West Coast groundfish trawl surveys that have been going on for 20 years, and they've done lots of tows right in the wind energy area and outside. They could do before, after control impact studies. They have to be funded. They're expensive. But I think that's what OPC should be using their $95 million for. Get going on seeing if these HRG surveys are impacting. They want to do 4,500 square miles of ocean.
Sherry, I really appreciate the comment. I am going to pause you because I want us to really be focused here on 30 by 30.
Well, 30 by 30 is about protecting the ocean. If you guys really want to protect the ocean, you should be protecting it from the threat that's happening right now. And if we don't show that what they're doing is causing damage, they'll just keep going. And
thank you, Sherry. We appreciate the comment, but we do need to move on. We appreciate the comment.
Yeah, that you guys are ignoring the elephant in the room.
We appreciate the comment. And you want to take us to our next commenter, please?
Yes, we're gonna jump back into our video chat. Sandy, I believe you're queued up next, and then Pam, you both have a question in the queue and on video. So Sandy?
I think Sandy asked hers, so I'll help
Oh,
out.
apologies. Sorry, when folks come online. Yeah,
No
then in
worries.
that case, Pam? Sorry, Pam, I believe you're on mute. We cannot hear your audio.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. When I use the headphones, it blows the audio portion. What if there is a failure of durable protection, say in a wetland area? To Mike's point, ground up collaboration get to durable protection and qualify for potential OECM status.
Then in order for something to be durable, it has to there has to be a managing agency or some sort of local government that it has gone through this process and can't be subject to simple reversal. That's the meaning the definition of durability is that it's durable. It can't be sort of simply undone. And so that's its own process. So I think that collaborations that Mike is talking about is sort of to help move that process along and get to those areas that are considered durable and meet that definition.
So one could start with the Regional Water Quality Control Board if the city is failing to do any type of durable protections, and then start the process from that end.
Yeah, exactly. That would be an example. Yeah.
Okay, thank
And then
you.
if the Regional Water Quality Control Board made an area, and then that area had gone through the Water Quality Control Board process, then it would be able to be evaluated and then be qualified as an OECM and then designated for 30 by 30 if it fits
Oh,
our criteria.
Thank you for the roadmap.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Pam. We have a question from Dave Coker next, and then Ricky in the chat.
Yeah, hi. Just had another question here. It's that last question kind of stimulated this. Is the 30-30 set in stone forever plan? Or is there flexibility in the future? I mean, is it going to be written into the plan and the implementation of 30-30? Is there an evaluation period to the effectiveness of it? Or, what happens in 2040? That's my question.
Yeah, I can take this one, Dave. So 30 by 30 is it's codified. Well, it was in executive order and now it's codified through, I think it was Senate Bill 337, maybe, and you can double check the number on that one and drop it in the chat. But yeah, so it is in legislation as a state goal. California's committed to it, but at least on the coastal water side, we definitely want to build in that monitoring and evaluation into our implementation of 30 by 30. So if we are designating areas as 30 by 30 conserved areas, how do we make sure that they are accomplishing their goals, right? And how do we potentially tweak the management of those areas if they're not protecting biodiversity, providing that access, providing that climate resilience that we want them to be? So yes, it's a state goal, but we definitely envision 30 by 30 as kind of an adaptive process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Alrighty, the next question that we have in the chat is from Ricky Erickson. So how RCAs fit? And Ricky, if you could clarify what you mean by RCAs.
Yeah, that was just in response to the question about durability, when Pam was asking about durability. And so I thought that if you could speak to, more specifically, what does durable mean? So do RC rockfish conservation areas or other fisheries management areas or apply?
Got it. Okay. Rockfish, I understand. So that is a great question. It's going to take me a second to sort of walk you through the process for it. So a rockfish conservation area is a type of fishery management area. So those areas are going to be evaluated using guidance from the FAO Fisheries OECM guidance. And so it will go through the process to look at those conservation areas, those fishery management areas, and determine whether they qualify as an OECM. There is a path for some fisheries management to qualify, and then there is a path where some fisheries management can be short-term, seasonal, or limited duration, and it won't end up qualifying or meet that sort of durability bar. And so through that process is sort of how something will end up being included and then potentially designated or
So-
not.
So you'll use the FAO OECM guidance for that portion of the fisheries management.
Yes.
Okay, super. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Alrighty, folks, since we're coming towards the end of our webinar, we have time for one more question if somebody wants to drop that in chat. If not, alrighty then. Just want to take a deep moment to thank you everybody for coming out and participating. Genuinely, it's hearing your input that is so important to this process, and it's what gets us out of bed, to do this great work to protect and steward our natural resources. So sincerely appreciate everybody joining, spending your lunch hour with us to do this. Just to reiterate some logistics in case you missed it at the beginning, we're going to be doing our summer in-person regional tour, meeting down in San Diego July 10th, meeting down in August 14th for Monterey. Thank you so much, Mina. And meeting down in Arcata in September 12th. And so all of this information can be found in the webinar workshop and public comment link that Mina dropped in the chat earlier. Please register. We would love to see you in person. We're going to have another one of these webinars tonight at 5 p.m. Duplicate, same information, just making it accessible. And with that, yeah, any final words, Abby and Mike, you want to add?
I would say that on that accessibility or regional workshops, we're going to do the same thing. We'll be meeting at lunch and then we'll be meeting after work as well. So we are genuinely trying to make connections and to hear people. I also want to say thank you. This is a complex process, but it should be complicated. This is hard work trying to figure out how to evaluate. And so we are really working hard and trying to hear from as many perspectives as possible to make sure that we sort of get this right and get it right for the ocean too.
I could not have said it better, Abby. Fully agree with all of that. Thank you guys so much for your input. And yeah, hope to see many of you at our regional workshops.
All right.
Take care, everyone.
Take care.